Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to be running you through some of the things that I wish I knew when I started shooting on film, specifically 16mm film, and also some of the things that you might want to take into consideration before beginning. 16mm is a really good format. I like it because it's the intersection between quality and value. Not that film is ever good value. 8mm and Super 8 film, the cameras are really cheap and affordable, but the quality is just not quite at the level that 16mm is. And obviously 35mm, the format above 16, is what movies are generally shot on, but it's so much more expensive, and 16mm will get the job done in most cases. So the first thing that you should be considering is which type of cameras you'll be using, and it comes down to two different categories. Ones that are shooting 100-foot daylight spools, such as over here, and then ones that are shooting on 400-foot cores, which are stored in cans. And these cameras here are some examples of those. The 100-foot daylight spools get 3 and a bit minutes. I'll put up the exact time at 24 frames per second. And these 400-foot cans get approximately 10-11 minutes at 24 frames per second. So right away, different projects are going to require different amounts of raw footage, and obviously these are a much shorter runtime, but they do have the advantage of being a much smaller camera. It's very easy to get into small spaces, and most of them actually don't require electricity. Most of them are spring wound. You can wind them up and they'll run with no electricity at all, whereas pretty much every camera that can shoot 400 feet is going to require a battery or power source of some sort. Now, it's not unheard of for a project to shoot multiple 100-foot daylight spools, especially if you're using something like a Bolex. A lot of people just don't have the need for a larger camera that shoots those bigger rolls, so they will just use multiple rolls of 100-foot, and that is fine. But where you'll start to find the drawback of these cameras, aside from runtime, is the fact that they don't have crystal speed motors. Generally, the 100-foot roll cameras will put out a lot more sound just as they're running. You'll be able to hear a lot more noise coming off of them than these ones, which are called self-blimped cameras, and that means that the camera body actually contains most of the sound that it generates when it's running, whereas these ones, they don't do that. So if you do need to record audio near the camera, or as you're shooting, you should be looking more towards one of these, unless you're going to re-record everything. So most of these 400-foot roll cameras will be able to shoot what I mentioned before, crystal speed, which means that the motor is kept at a constant speed and it's not going to drift slower or faster, which means they're actually going to record and it'll be in complete sync with the audio. It's not going to slip. You're not going to have people's mouths not matching up with their actual speech that's recorded on the audio recorder. If you do need to record any form of dialogue or like a music performance, something like that, you're absolutely going to be going for these ones. Then again, deciding factor is often the price. As you can imagine from what I've been saying already, the 100-foot cameras are far more affordable, they're more accessible, there's a lot more of them available, and I can go on. Now, the 400-foot capable cameras are obviously a lot more expensive, but it's for good reason, and they can handle a larger variety of tasks. Generally, people are renting them if they don't own their own camera. It's pretty rare for people to be renting one of these sort of cameras, maybe for a small project. On a lot of projects, especially with a larger budget, they tend to rent these, but of course you can buy one if you can find it for a decent price, and then it's yours to use whenever. I prefer owning a camera to renting one. Another big difference between these types of cameras on either side of me is the viewing system. A lot of the more affordable cameras in this sort of category, the 100-foot category, they don't always have a reflex viewfinder, which means sometimes what you're seeing isn't exactly what the film frame will see, but they do have corrections and things like that in the viewfinder, so you can get a very accurate frame, although you can't always see it, and sometimes you're focusing via the distance markings on the lens, which can scare off people. But in the case of like the Bolex H16M I've got here, which is a non-reflex version of the H16, I shot a whole test roll, which you're seeing right now, and that came out perfect. Every shot was in focus how I expected, and I just set the distance on the viewfinder and on the lens, and it came out just fine, even though I couldn't see anything through the taking lens. There are some 100-foot roll cameras that do have reflex viewing. It's either through a prism, which splits the light in two directions. One way is through the viewfinder and the other straight to the film. You do lose a little bit of light in the process, and it can sometimes degrade the image depending on the condition of the prism. You'll find that with some of the higher end Bolexes. Just because it costs more doesn't mean the footage is going to turn out better. There are some cameras in that category that don't use a prism but still have reflex viewing. They achieve that through a mirrored shutter, one of those cameras being the Arriflex 16S, and then there's also the infamous Krasnogorsk 3 or K3, which a lot of beginners like to pick up because they are affordable. They do have their drawbacks, but if you can get one working in good condition, I guess they are handy. Now, when you come to these larger and more high-end cameras that do take the 400-foot rolls, almost every one of them is going to have a reflex shutter, so there's no degradation of the image. A couple cameras may have a dogleg finder on the lens like some of the early Cinema Products cameras or Oricon cameras, but generally they're all going to have an uncompromised reflex viewing system. On both styles of camera you do have the option of changing a speed, whether it be slow frame rates for a semi time-lapse like 8 frames per second, which you're seeing here played back at 24. There's 24 frames, which you're used to generally in movies, sometimes 25 frames, and then there's obviously the higher speeds for semi-slow motion. One thing I should mention is if you do have a 100-foot roll, you can generally shoot them in these larger cameras. A lot of them can accept a 100-foot roll in their magazines. Not all of them, but a lot can. So if you do want to be able to shoot film between both formats, that's sometimes possible. And it's a little bit finicky, but it is possible to load one of the 100-foot daylight spools off of a 400-foot roll in the dark, or have a lab do it for you. But generally it's just easier to keep the film in the can or the daylight spool. One thing that you'll notice about these cameras right away when you start researching them is that they're not very cheap. And yes, they have gone up in price quite a lot over the last 5-10 years as they've become more popular, and they haven't been making them since the 2000s, the last ones anyway. So there is a dwindling supply around the world, and obviously some of them get damaged as well and stop working. It is a lot of money to invest in a piece of equipment. I recommend that you dip your toes into 16mm a little bit before diving in and just buying a camera. Make sure that it's something you enjoy shooting. It's not for everybody, and that's okay. There's a big community online. There's a lot of people that are really passionate about these cameras, and if you reach out to the right person, they'll probably let you use the camera for free or for very little, and they'll be happy to help you out and get you started in just shooting your first test roll, because that is the most valuable thing, to be able to try it and get a feel for it before you dive right in. And maybe you won't like it at all, and that's okay. It's not for everyone, but it is a very different process to shooting digital, and if you haven't shot it before, it can be a little bit daunting, but it's not as scary as it seems. I do recommend that most people give it a shot. Yeah, you don't have to buy one straight away. I recommend that you try one. You can rent it if you really want to and you have a project that warrants it, but don't be afraid to reach out to people online in forums, on Facebook groups, Instagram, people that are using these cameras already, and just ask them for advice if you're unsure about something. Now, when it comes time to shooting your test roll in one of these cameras, a lot of people tend to think about running to grab some 500T and shooting something like in a similar style to what they would when they're shooting digitally. I would personally recommend that you just find a really sunny day and shoot something in your backyard, whether it be your dog, your cat, the garden, flowers, plants outside, anything. Daylight is really valuable because you don't have to set up any lighting, it's just there. You should get a light meter, of course. It doesn't even have to be a motion picture light meter. You can just set 1/64 as your 24 frames exposure time and try different frame rates, see what you like the look of. A lot of people that have moved from shooting digitally to film, one thing that a lot of former digital shooters will do when they're shooting film is shoot wide open. I don't recommend doing that, partly because the lenses are a bit softer on these older cameras, but also they're not dialed in as well. The focus markings on them might not be very well calibrated. Focus by eye where you can, focus by distance where you have to, and try and shoot in the mid-range of the f-stops. So f5.6, f.8 to a f.11 where you have to. You can obviously shoot wider, but you're going to get the best results in the middle, at least in my opinion. One thing a lot of people are unsure about when they start using 16mm is the film stocks and which type they should be using. Obviously a lot of people, especially with the digital background, they just run for the 500T because it's the highest ISO and it's what they hear about all the time, especially if they look at the Kodak Shoot Film Instagram page. I would suggest avoiding that because it's not necessary at all, and the higher the ISO of film, the shorter it will store for with good results, and the more grain you'll see and less contrast. It does have its place. It's personally not for me. Don't be afraid to shoot a lower ISO like 200T or 50D in sunlight on a really sunny day, because I think the results will speak for themselves. There is also 250D, which is very popular. On a really sunny day, 50D outdoors will be more than suitable, and you'll be closing the lens up quite a bit. If you're shooting something higher ISO outdoors like 250D, you'll probably need to bring in an ND filter when it gets really bright. That's probably best suited for an overcast day. Unlike digital, film stocks have a set white balance, so it'll either be daylight or it'll be tungsten balanced. The daylight stocks being 50D and 250D, the tungsten stocks being 200T and 500T. My personal recommendation as an all-rounder stock would be 200T. It is really beautiful when you expose it right in tungsten lighting, and it can also be shot very easily in daylight, both with and without a filter. When you're using a color correction filter to shoot it in daylight, such as an 85B filter, the ISO drops down to 125 due to a loss, but generally you don't even need a filter, and it's very easy to shoot it in daylight and have it look pretty normal. You can just correct out the color a little bit. I guess the 85B filter is mainly if you're really printing from the film rather than scanning it, and you need the color balance to be close enough as it is in the gate. I mentioned 500T before being a very popular stock and warning against it. And one thing I'll warn against even more is pushing it multiple stops. You can obviously do that, and a lot of people do, especially to utilize existing light in low light conditions, nighttime for example. But 16mm is a smaller format than 35mm. With it being a smaller format, you should be trying to look towards a lower grain option, and that means lower ISO stocks like 200T and 50D. So when you're pushing something that's already quite high at 500 ISO, quite high grain, when you're pushing that multiple stops, which means you're shooting it as if it were a higher ISO. So to push it one stop would be to expose it at 1000 ISO, and then the lab develops it accordingly, and you do end up with a negative that was 1000 ISO, but it comes with a trade-off, and that trade-off is a larger amount of grain, maybe doubling of visible grain, which is already quite high. Instead, I recommend just sticking to 200T and lighting it accordingly. Now, 200 ISO must sound pretty crazy if you're used to shooting 3200, 6400 or 12800 or whatever from a digital sensor, and it is quite low in comparison, but it's very easy to light when you have the right equipment. One thing that a lot of people don't take into account when they start shooting on motion picture film is that the lighting kits you were using to shoot with a DSLR or a mirrorless camera beforehand aren't going to be sufficient for exposing a much lower ISO frame. So you may need to upgrade your lighting kit. There are options in the LED space. I've shot whole films using LED lights, but they are quite high wattage compared to what you might have been using previously. For example, I use multiple 220 watt LED Fresnel lights on my films, and if you're diffusing it, obviously you need to really pump it up. But one much cheaper alternative, although harder to diffuse because there's heat, is tungsten lighting. And once everything sort of switched to digital in the 2010s, these lights became really, really affordable because they were just being thrown out and disregarded by everybody. These tungsten lights, often you'll be using them as hard lighting, but it can be diffused. They are really beautiful. Obviously they do suck up a bit more power, so generally you'll be using them where you have AC outlet access and they're not really as easily usable on a battery. Maybe you need a generator. For a lot of purposes, they're a really affordable way to get into lighting that will light even 50 ISO if you have enough of them. There are more stocks than just the color negative range which I've been through. There are a couple black and white stocks. Some of them can be developed into a reversal image, which means it's projectable because it's not a negative. And there is also a color reversal option, Ektachrome 100, which was used for the most recently released season of Euphoria on 35mm format. And unlike those color negative stocks I was talking about before, Ektachrome produces, instead of a negative, it produces a reversal image, which is a positive, and you can view it normally. You can run it through a projector if you really want and watch it on the wall like people used to do in the old days. It does come with some trade-offs, which are that it's only available in daylight color balance. At least these days, the only option is a daylight color balance, and the other one is that it has a lower dynamic range, and it's going to be easier to blow out the highlights, whereas the color negative range, your 50D, 250D, 200T and 500T have a much higher dynamic range, and they can handle much more highlight detail without blowing out so quickly. One benefit that 16mm motion picture film has over 35mm is that all the color film stocks, whether it be negative or Ektachrome, are much easier to get hold of in 16mm format than they are 35mm. And that's because, especially with the removal of a layer called Remjet, which made it hard to be developed in a stills lab, it's now being used more and more as a still film in 35mm. People will get hold of the 35mm can and roll up little canisters to shoot in their still cameras to save money, and Kodak's not a fan of that. So if you're trying to get 35mm, they make you fill out all these documents and prove that it's actually for a motion picture film, and you're not just going to spool it up and save money. Now, if you've got the camera, you've got the lens, you've got your light meter and your lighting kit, you will still need a few accessories before you start shooting. Some things I recommend are a daylight changing bag. These aren't as necessary if you're shooting 100-foot spools, because you can load them in subdued light and be able to see what you're doing, but when you unload the roll at the end, if you're not doing it in the dark, you will lose a second or two of footage. Whereas if you do it in the daylight changing bag, you'll be able to retain every frame right till the end. With these larger cameras, loading it in the dark is essential, at least loading the magazine which comes off the camera. With either type of camera, you'll probably want to get some scrap film from a lab or someone that shoots film already, just to practice loading and get the idea of it before you're actually using your stock that you've purchased. In addition to that, you'll need either a daylight spool for your take-up if the camera doesn't already have one, and just with these ones, you'll need a take-up core, assuming the magazine doesn't already have one. And a lab will generally give you that. A lab will also give you empty cans if you ask them politely. When it comes to shooting your test film or your first project on film, you should obviously be aware of the runtime that your format has, whether it be 100 or 400 foot. There's a Kodak Cinema Tools app which lets you type in the amount of film you've got and the frame rate, and it will give you an approximate runtime. I use it quite a lot. With a limited runtime, obviously it is a little bit daunting, especially if you're used to just running forever and ever and ever. I think it is beneficial because it's much easier to edit. You get better performances generally from actors and talent. Having a little bit of stress on set is a good thing. Does that mean that you're not allowed to get more than one take? Absolutely not. Work out how long you can shoot for. You can account for having more than one take. If you're not happy with the performance, don't be afraid to shoot another take. I think it's better to have 2 takes than be really tight on film and be unhappy with the take that you got when you only did one. Obviously, there is a limit to that. You shouldn't be doing 20 takes for no reason. Shooting film doesn't mean that you can't do more than one take. You should try and get a good product at the end of the day, no matter what format you're using. If you're used to shooting fully automatic on everything, it's going to be a little bit of a learning curve when it comes to shooting a camera like these that is completely manual in every control. Really take care to get to know the camera, get really comfortable pulling focus with these cameras. You can obviously use a follow focus. I generally just focus by eye and sort of try not to change the focus too much during takes, but you could pull crazy focus during takes if you mark it properly and prepare. If you're not used to using a light meter, that's something you should change quite quickly. It's not hard to do at all. You just sort of stick it where the subject is, measure the light coming towards them, or you can use different versions where you can read through a viewfinder. You should really try and become comfortable taking exposure readings with a light meter, because at the end of the day, if something is too underexposed, the footage is not really usable. And obviously film does have more tolerance for overexposure, but there is a limit to that, and if the highlights are blown out, it's sort of hard to work with. You do want to find the correct exposure for different scenarios, and if you're not happy with the f-stop you've got, you can obviously add more lighting, or you can reduce the lighting. Now, a little tip I'm going to give you is that if you're not getting enough light and there's no real human subjects that are moving and it's sort of a static shot, don't be afraid to just slow down the frame rate to increase your exposure time, allowing you to get a better f-stop or just get an exposure. Shooting at 8 frames per second on a static subject is fine. You're not going to notice much of a difference at all, and that can be a really easy way to cheat your way into exposing the frame when the light isn't giving you what you need. And also some of the higher end cameras, the Eclair being one of them, the Eclair MPR, they do have a variable shutter angle, which is another way to control your light coming through and your exposure, but that does have an effect on the motion blur, which can be used creatively. Once your footage is shot, whether it be a test roll or a project, you package it up and take it to your local motion picture lab, and Kodak does have a website which lists all the labs in the world. You take it to the lab and organize with them how it's going to be processed. If you do want to push it, you want to pull it, which is the opposite, they can do that for an extra fee, but generally you're just asking for a standard process and either a prep for telecine, which is scanning, or have them scan it as well. A lot of labs do scanning as well as developing. When it comes to having it scanned, especially if it's being done at the same time as developing, you want to supply either a portable hard drive or SSD for your scans to come back to you on. But some labs do offer an over-the-web service for the file transfer, but keep in mind often that comes at the cost of it being a different file type and a bit more compressed. But obviously the benefit of the web transfer of your file is it being an instant transfer of the data, and you don't have to wait for it to either arrive in the mail or to pick it up from the lab yourself. So if you're really on a time crunch, that can be a good option. The lab will generally want specifics about what resolution of scan you want, and they'll also be asking you whether you want the scan to be a tight crop to the film frame, or if you want a full overscan, which is when they scan the largest image area on the film, including sometimes the sprockets. And when it comes to having it scanned, the specifics of the scan will also be determined by whether your film is standard 16mm or super 16mm, or even the rarer format ultra 16mm. And now we're at my next point. You often hear a lot of talk, and you'll see during a research that super 16 is a very popular format, but it's not always necessary. For example, none of the cameras you see in front of me are super 16 converted, and I don't even own any. Standard 16, the standard 16mm format, which was introduced in the 1920s, is a 4:3 image, and I think it's, pretty sufficient for most uses. Super 16 is something that was developed later in the 1960s. It creates a slightly larger image and slightly wider image by utilizing part of the film which used to hold the optical soundtrack. A lot of the super 16mm cameras have been converted later on. Some of them are factory, especially some of the later models. They were super 16 from the factory, but being something that's often converted, not every conversion is good quality, and sometimes it is compromising your image, and also it's off the original center of the film, and the lens mount needs to be moved across accordingly. So there's something to take into account. Now, one benefit that standard 16 has over super 16 is a lot more lenses will cover the image area, whereas super 16 isn't as capable when it comes to some of the wider lenses, and you'll have a vignette coming through on the edges, and that can be quite irritating, although you can crop it out when it's minimal. I think that standard 16 actually has a benefit of being closer to a square image, and it fits both vertical and horizontal screens quite well, whereas super 16, if you're sharing that on social media for advertising, for example, it's not going to fill the frame as well, and you have bigger bars above and below, although you can obviously crop, but when you're cropping you have more degradation in the image. So I have seen more ad campaigns that were even shot digitally using the 4:3 ratio, because it seems to be an all-rounder for the delivery of the times we're in. Ultra 16 I actually think is a better format than super 16 because it doesn't change the centering of the frame. It keeps it equal, and it actually shrinks a little bit on the top and goes in between both sides equally, giving you a 1.85 image, whereas I think super 16 is 1.66 or 1.7 something. Super 16 generally has a very high entry point because it's more in demand, whereas standard 16mm cameras are far more affordable because there's a much smaller pool of people that are after them, and that is an advantage if you're after one of them. When it comes to some of these earlier cameras, and some of the most affordable ones. Something that you should be mindful of when you're looking at them is if they use 2perf 16mm film. This right here is a Cine Kodak Model K. It's from the early 1930s, I believe. Very affordable. I picked that up for very little on eBay, and it does run, but it uses 2perf 16mm film. I converted it to single perf myself, but now it has a little bit of a registration problem, which is easily corrected by a small crop and stabilization, but generally you want to look for a camera these days that shoots single perf 16mm, unless you're in America where it is possible to get 2perf film which has sprockets running down both sides as opposed to one. If you're looking at an early camera, even some of the Bolexes that seems quite cheap and is very old, have a look at the photos carefully if it's online, and look at the main wheel in the middle, the sprocket wheel, see if it has two sides of sprockets or one. Now the larger 16mm cameras shooting 400 foot, they're all pretty much ready to shoot modern stocks. Having the camera body is one thing, but obviously you need a lens to capture an image at all. Try and find a camera that does already include a lens. It is common for sellers to remove lenses off cameras and try and sell them separately, or sell the lenses off a body with some digital adapter, but I recommend that you try and find a camera that already has a lens, and that saves a lot of trouble. But if you need to get a separate lens, if you need to get a lens for your camera, it doesn't have one when you buy it, you don't have to always go for the most expensive. Generally, I've had good success just using, at least on these kinds of cameras, I've been using an Ingenue 12-120 zoom lens, which is usually from the 1960s. That sort of lens is often laughed at or frowned upon by people that work with expensive lenses from rental houses, but the footage looks pretty good to my eye and I enjoy using them. Obviously they're not going to be as sharp as something that's really expensive, but I think your money's better put towards film stock, unless it's a really important project and it needs to be the absolute most pristine, sharp image you can get. With these cameras, you're not going to be using a zoom lens. These 100-footers usually have a prime lens included, or will take a prime lens. That's partly because of the viewing system. It doesn't lend itself to a zoom lens. Like this Cine Kodak Special right here has a 25mm lens included with it, and you can see the footage here. I used it at night time, 8 frames per second, and it's quite interesting. It's double exposed in camera. It's more than capable, and I just guessed my distance and sort of set it and hoped for the best. That was shot at f5.6. When it comes to 16mm, especially when you're used to shooting on larger sensors from some digital cameras, you should try and learn a little bit about what the focal lengths mean on a 16mm format, because on a smaller format like 16mm, 25mm, a 50mm lens mean different things. There are charts online that convert the depth of field so you can try and understand it, but generally the most common depth of field you'll find on these primes on these sort of cameras is about 25mm or 20mm sometimes. A telephoto lens could be anywhere from 75mm to 120, 150mm, and there's heaps in the middle. A wide angle could be 8mm, 5.6mm, and when you get into some of the more wide angle lenses on these cameras, some of them don't even have a focusing ring. They're what's called a retrofocus lens, which means most things will be in focus within a certain range. Now, I mentioned you have to be mindful of these cameras being single or double perf. Something you should be mindful of when it comes to these larger cameras is the power source. Some of them will generally take a weird kind of nickel cadmium battery that's obsolete or hard to get hold of. If you're buying a camera secondhand that's not from someone that's used it in recent times, you should really do your research on what kind of power supply it uses. Generally with all these cameras, I've found the easiest way to get it running straight away, if the batteries are a bit funny, is to create some sort of an AC power adapter. I've done that with this one, using this one here, by using a laptop charger, and I wired it in. But yeah, you absolutely need to try and find out what sort of power source it uses, what voltage. The Eclair over here is quite an easy one because it doesn't actually take an onboard battery. It just uses either a 3 or 4 pin XLR power cable, and I've had great success running that one off of a V-mount battery just because the voltages happen to line up, and just using a power cord adapter. This Cinema Products one that's closer to me was a little bit trickier because it uses a 20 volt battery, and I most recently converted it to run off power tool batteries. which was a bit of a project in itself, but it's worth it because this is my camera that I use to shoot crystal sync dialogue, and being able to shoot it away from the power outlet is really handy for me. Another thing about these cameras that may need attention is if they have a belt inside, which can become perished. I did have that with this camera when I bought it for a cheap price. I needed to replace that myself to get it running. The Eclair hasn't been serviced since I think probably the 70s or 80s, and it keeps running just fine. But some cameras like Arton and Araflex cameras will need a little bit more attention and more servicing. I guess you can think of it a bit like a car, like you're buying a car from the 80s or 90s or 70s that happens to still exist now, and it's going to need some maintenance to keep running. These 100-foot cameras, especially the ones that are spring wound and mechanical sort of clockwork machines, they generally don't need very much attention and need far less servicing to run properly, and you will have better success buying them secondhand, sight unseen. But obviously some of them will still need attention, and you can have them serviced, and you probably should if you're using it enough to warrant it. Another learning curve that you might come across when beginning to use these sorts of cameras is not having a video tap and monitors to look at as you're shooting. Some of the really high-end versions of these 400-foot cameras may have a video tap installed, or you can have one installed, but generally when it comes to a 16mm camera, especially 100-foot, the majority have no sort of video tap at all, and you're going to be looking through a viewfinder, whether it's a reflex one or an offset one, to frame up and shoot. I think before trying to find a video tap solution, you should at least try shooting without one at all. I personally think it's a great thing to do. It means you're a little bit more aware on set of things going on outside the camera, and it also stops you being so distracted by other people standing around you as you're shooting and looking at the image with you. It lets the camera operator have a little bit more control and a little bit less pressure, and they can sort of just follow what they see a little bit easier. It's much nicer to be looking through an optical viewfinder, a real optical viewfinder, not a screen one. And that leads me into another point, which is just the workflow of shooting on film is something to get used to, but it should be something that you end up enjoying generally. You'll find as soon as the camera's running on set and people can, hear it whirring and the film's running through, they know that it costs money. They're going to be more focused. Your talent is going to be putting in just a little bit more effort because they know there's pressure and they can't just do endless takes. They have to sort of try and nail it and as few as possible. And then the final thing is just the image at the end of the day. You're going to have this beautiful footage if you do it right. Now, you will need to sort of teach yourself a little bit of grading, color grading, when it comes to using your scanned footage and processing that into a timeline. Of course, there are professionals who do color grading for a living, but if you're shooting 16mm, especially on a bit of a budget, you should try and learn at least how to grade your footage. And there are some tutorials online. You're just going to have to play around a bit with the color wheels and try and just nail it to what looks good to your eye. I haven't really got any tips for it. I sort of just taught myself after watching one or two videos. There was an Australian guy, not me, but there was an Australian filmmaker who had a really good tutorial about grading film scans, which I used to teach myself a little bit, and he decided to gatekeep and he deleted the video, which is pretty sad, but there are still some good tutorials out there where you can learn how to grade it. But yeah, the lab, you can ask the lab to grade it a little bit and they may adjust your scan a little bit to make it easy to sort of get a final image. But at the end of the day, it's going to be you tweaking it to what looks good for your project. And you need to invest a little bit of time and effort into learning that process. But once you have it down, it's really easy to do, and you can just grade a clip without thinking twice. The scans generally do come to you as sort of a raw log type file, and it needs a lot of tweaking to be at a viewable stage. As we're coming towards the end of the video, I do want to say that if you shoot some 16mm film and you're not really happy with how it came out for whatever reason, don't let that be too disheartening, because everybody will make a mistake at some point, and that's sort of part of what makes it so satisfying when you do get it right, because it is a little bit of a challenge. But shooting completely manual and, lighting accordingly or exposing accordingly and having to adapt to all these different things, and all of that makes it really satisfying when you do get an image that you're happy with and you have footage that you're really proud to show other people. So if your first experience isn't good, don't write it off completely. And if it's underexposed, the colors look wrong, whatever it is, or if you think there's an actual issue with your camera, talk to people that are shooting film or have a lab or the scanning facility, whoever. Reach out to somebody and say, Why does it look the way it does? What could I do to change it next time? And anybody that knows what they're talking about will be happy to give you advice on improving and avoiding the issues if there are any. But if you really do your research and do all your preparation, you don't have to worry too much about the final product, because you know that you've done everything in your control to make it come out right. And I get the final image looking how I expected. I hope that this video has been helpful for you, and I've covered as much as I could think of anyway. If you're still unsure about anything, or you want a little bit more advice about something specific, leave a comment, or you can reach out on my Instagram page and I'll be happy to give you my 2 cents. Shooting on film should be something that is exciting. Don't let it become too scary, because I think it's a privilege to use film, and it's really rewarding in the process and in the results. And except for a couple gatekeepers here and there, most people using film want to share the knowledge and spread it and help new people learn it and really share their passion, because it's only going to be around for as long as people continue to use it and keep these cameras alive.